John George Haigh was the serial killer from Middle England who killed the middle class.
He had no compunction and no conscience whatsoever about killing people to obtain his ends.
The sludge at the bottom of the barrels in which he's dissolved these poor people is poured down the drains. You know, he's literally obliterating an entire family.
I was just a young boy in the late 1940s, but I can remember the name John George Haigh as if it were yesterday. The newspaper headlines were sensationalist, from vampire horror to modern-day Dracula. But the one that was to stick was the acid bath murderer. So was John George Haigh a callous fraudster or a killer out for blood?
I'm Fred Dinage, and I've been reporting serious crimes for more than 40 years now as a journalist and a television reporter. As the official biographer to the Kray twins, I know that when it comes to crime, the myth can actually take over from the reality of what actually happened.
John George Haigh's crimes were some of the most shocking ever seen in Britain. Driven by greed, he killed 6 people, disposing of their bodies in an appalling manner. Plunging the victims into vats of acid, he left no trace of their remains. John George Haigh was born in 1909 in Stamford, Lincolnshire. He was well loved by his parents and was an only child. He had a relatively isolated upbringing.
Well, I'm keen to talk to experts and key witnesses with an in-depth knowledge of the Haigh case. Sadly, of course, many of the key characters have now passed away. But I have managed to track down a man with a keen interest in Haigh, David Briffett. In the 1980s, David spent a lot of time interviewing key witnesses and wrote a book about Haigh's atrocities. David, this is amazing because this is the very courtroom in which Haigh was tried and convicted. What turned this apparently well-educated and religious man, do you think, to crime?
Well, I have a theory about Mr. Haigh, and I'm pretty sure that he wanted to assume the lifestyle of other people that he admired. And the reason for that can be traced right back to his very strange childhood. His parents were members of the Plymouth Brethren, and he was deprived of many things. They didn't celebrate Christmas, and eventually, when he discovered the outside world, he rather liked it, and he wanted to be part of it, and he was prepared to go to more or less any lengths to obtain that better lifestyle.
At the age of 10, Haigh won a musical scholarship to a Catholic school in Wakefield. Even at such a young age, he was described by his teachers as mischievous.
What led him then into a life of crime?
Well, there's evidence to show that when he was at school, he was very secretive. He enjoyed playing tricks on people, and he learned very early that he could forge people's signatures. And he used to forge the signatures of teachers, and he got a lot of pleasure out of that, having these secrets. And then he gradually moved into petty crime and into forgery.
I want to know how Haigh's early life of crime led him to become a killer. Professor David Wilson is a leading criminologist, and he's taken an in-depth look at the crimes Haigh committed.
So tell us about the fraud. I mean, how did he get into that? What was his motivation there?
Well, he left school age 17 and worked for a little while in a blue-collar job, but very quickly transferred into white-collar work. And he first comes to the attention of the courts or to the police because he tries to fraudulently sell cars that don't belong to him. So the motivation, psychologists, criminologists would say, his motivations were extrinsic. They were outside of his own personality. His motivation, in other words, was simply to make money.
But of course, he had the most convincing manner, and he could talk anyone round to do anything. He was a wonderful salesman. He could charm the birds out of the trees. He always dressed very well. He liked the best suits. He had brill-creamed hair that was flat, but he had the most penetrating, sparkling blue eyes, which many, many people noticed.
In 1934, Haigh used his charming manner to persuade people to purchase vehicles that didn't exist. It wasn't long before the money was rolling in.
Haigh wrote many letters documenting his early life and his atrocities. Haigh said, "I discovered there were easier ways to make a living than to work long hours in an office. I did not ask myself whether I was doing right or wrong. That seemed to be irrelevant. I merely said, this is what I wish to do.
He always, I think, reading through the lines, felt slightly outside of the culture to which he belonged. And so a lot of his life, it would seem, was about playing a part. So he always wanted to drive fast cars, to look the part, to be fashionable, to have money. He often gives the impression of trying to live above his means.
Haigh quickly discovered that crime didn't pay. His car scam was uncovered. He was imprisoned for 15 months at Leeds Assizes. On his release, he was soon back to what he considered to be his profession: fraud.
One of his major frauds was committed in Surrey and in Sussex. In fact, he opened 3 offices as a solicitor. He never was a solicitor, of course, but he opened 3 offices, one in Chancery Lane in London, one in Guildford in Surrey, and one in Hastings in Sussex. And he called himself William Cato Adamson, and he had some wonderful headed notepaper printed. And then he began placing advertisements in local newspapers offering shares for sale, shares that supposedly had come from the estates of deceased persons. And he was offering them at slightly below the market rate. And of course people were very attracted to that and began sending in cheques to this solicitor. Haigh lived very well off the cheques. However, he was caught out because on one of his headed note papers he had misspelt the word Guildford, and he had left out the D in the middle. And one of the prospective purchasers spotted that, went to the police, didn't think a solicitor would make a basic error like that, and Haigh was arrested as a result of that error.
Well, according to court records, Haigh was imprisoned 3 times between 1934 and 1943 for theft and fraud. But prison life didn't dampen his desire to make money. He knew if he was to become a part of high society, then he'd have to learn how to commit the perfect crime.
Haigh's time in prison was far removed from the lavish lifestyle he aspired to. He thought himself a class above the petty criminals that he was now rubbing shoulders with.
I'm about to meet a man who knows what life is like in Britain's toughest prisons. Bobby Cummins was convicted of armed robbery and manslaughter. He now runs a charity called Unlock, which helps ex-offenders. And he knows at first hand the experiences you pick up from being around hardened criminals.
If you're in prison and you want to leave crime behind, it can be a great place for rehabilitation. If, like Haigh, you were a prolific offender, if you like, you had the injury, you wanted to learn about crime. Greatest university in the world is prison, because there you can network, there's people there with different skills. So he would have been planning his next move.
In prison, Haigh learned about the crimes committed in France in 1925 by the double murderer Serret. To avoid capture, Serret disposed of the bodies in sulphuric acid.
Haigh learned a great deal about the British legal system while he was in prison, thanks to books from the prison library brought to him by the Padre. But more importantly, he learned about the uses of sulphuric acid from the prison library books too. So he learned a great deal about crime and a great deal about acids.
He would have been told the weakest link is your victim, because especially in fraud, your face is going up. It's not like if you're an armed robber and you're putting a mask over your face or anything like that. With fraud, it's front on. So therefore, the victim can identify you in ID parades, in photographs, that sort of thing. So if you're at the fraud game, there's 9 out of 10 odds that you're actually going to get nicked for the offence. So they would have said to him the weakest link is your victims. And in any criminality, what you've got to do is eliminate the weakest link.
Haigh began formulating a sinister plan, one he would put into action on the day of his release. But to prepare, he needed the assistance of fellow prisoners and access to sulphuric acid.
It was during his time in Lincoln Prison that he was given a position in the tinsmith factory. There he gained access to sulphuric acid. He wanted to discover if, like Serret, he could dissolve bone and tissue.
He used to bribe other prisoners with small amounts of tobacco. These prisoners were allowed outside the prison walls during the day, and they would bring dead field mice back into the prison for Haigh. And Haigh also stole small amounts of sulphuric acid from the stores. And obviously, while the warders weren't watching, he would line up the jars on a workbench, fill each jar with a small amount of acid, and then drop a mouse into each jar. And then very patiently would sit and watch to see how long it would take a mouse to disintegrate in a certain amount of sulphuric acid. So in other words, he worked out a scientific formula which he thought maybe later he could apply to a human being. And all he wanted was the opportunity.
I'm Fred Dinage, and I'm examining the life of John George Haigh. He was known as the acid bath murderer because of the horrific way he disposed of his victims.
In 1941, John George Haigh was serving a sentence for theft in Lincoln Prison. It was his 3rd spell in prison, but Haigh was determined that when he was released, he would make money from a life of crime. No one would stand in his way.
But it's still quite a leap, isn't it, from fraud to murder?
It is a big leap, but again, the motivation for Haigh simply seems to be an extension of the frauds that he committed earlier in the 1930s and earlier in the 1940s. But essentially, he wants to make money.
Haigh left prison and began looking for a wealthy victim to exploit. A chance meeting at the Goat pub in Kensington presented him with the opportunity he'd been looking for. William McSwan had employed Haigh as his chauffeur back in the 1930s. They'd become friends, but lost touch when Haigh went looking for other work.
How close was Haigh then to McSwan and vice versa?
Well, John Haigh and William McSwan were both the same age, and they got on very well, and for a period they became quite close friends. Haigh certainly admired young McSwan's lifestyle because he used to collect the rents of the 6 McSwan properties in West London. And I think Haigh watched him do this job and realised that he was obtaining quite a nice sum of money every week that his family lived on, and he wanted that lifestyle.
Haigh regaled his old boss with tales of his own recent business ventures, although he'd actually been in prison. Over the next few days, they would meet several more times. Haigh was just waiting for the perfect moment to put the plans he'd hatched in prison into action.
Haigh said he had an engineering workshop. McSwan said he had some pinball machines that he wanted repaired, and Haigh said he would do the work, and he invited McSwan down to the basement.
No one truly knows what happened to William McSwan. Haigh's own account recalls that his old friend asked him to look at a pinball machine. With his head bent, Haigh pulled out a metal bar and killed William McSwan with several heavy blows.
Haigh was left with the body of his murdered friend. Using the skills he'd learned in prison, he dumped his first victim in acid.
He'd stolen an oil drum from an old wartime bomb site, and he got the body of McSwan into the oil drum, and then he began the macabre business of filling it with acids. In order to protect Haigh from the acids, he developed